Welcome, everyone, to our first of two afternoon sessions. My name is Dorian Warren. I'm an assistant professor of political science and public affairs here at Columbia. And we have a fantastic panel this afternoon on case studies in the turnaround of low-performing schools. And we have some fantastic panelists, one of whom is still on his way. So he will join us and take us through this fantastic PowerPoint presentation momentarily. But let me just briefly introduce two of our panelists that are here now and the third person who's on his way. First up, we'll have Greg Bethiel, who is with the New York City Department of Education. Yes, in the Department of Portfolio Planning. Is that right? Yes.
So what he's covering for right now is that the two people from the New York City Department of Education that were supposed to be here for the panel are not here yet. So I'm Greg Bethiel from the Department of Education. I work in the Office of School Programs and Partnerships. Eric Nadelstern, who you heard from earlier this morning, is my boss, but I've spent time working with our turnaround efforts in our Division of Portfolio Planning and have had some experience in starting new schools and thought I would do a job of pinch hitting this afternoon.
Great. So Greg's going to go first. He'll be followed by Alex Schub. Alex is Executive Director of School Development at the New York City Department of Education. In this role, he's responsible for developing and implementing a variety of school improvement strategies, focusing primarily on opening new schools to replace low-performing schools. And the full bios of our presenters are in your binder, so I won't go through their extended narratives. And we're also really pleased to have Alex Schneider, who is the Municipal Secretary of Education of Sao Paulo. As Secretary, he's in charge of over 2,900 schools with more than 1 million students, 82,000 employees, and a huge budget, $4.2 billion budget. And we're very pleased to have him on the panel, who'll provide some brief comments comparing the Sao Paulo experience to New York. So first, we're going to start with Greg, followed by Alex, the two Alexes.
Greg, do you want to go up to the... So somebody said earlier that they were going to speak off the cuff, and that will certainly be this, since I found out about 4.5 minutes ago that I'd be doing this. I think the most important thing to understand when we talk about case studies of turnaround schools is that there are lots of different visions for what it means to turn around a school, whether that's a high school, an elementary school, or a middle school. And I think, as you heard our chancellor talking earlier today and the mayor, some of that began with a set of accountability changes that had us very clearly identifying which schools were successful with kids and which schools were struggling, and most importantly, which schools were persistently low achieving and failing students on a regular basis. And we've had a wave of reforms that have come across the New York City schools and across the country over the last 30 years that have begun to look at what the levers for change inside of school organizations were. We've had waves where we've tried to make schools smaller and more personal by doing small learning communities in high schools. And we found out that that worked to some extent, but never really moved us over the hump of making sure that schools really became successful organizations. You've heard a number of references today to Michelle Cahill and the work that's gone on here in New York City. And even as we were talking over breakfast this morning, one of the things that really began to change the approach to turnaround in New York City happened back in 2002 and 2003, when we really began to look at the data telling us what our school populations looked like and what were the factors that were really contributing to school performance. And I may get the numbers a little bit wrong, and Michelle will certainly correct me, but lots of people think that the effort in New York City was about going to small schools. And it turned out when we looked at school size as a factor in whether or not schools were high performing or low performing, school size only accounted for about 9% of the impact. So it was not size by itself that made the difference. What we also knew is that when you looked at concentrations of our lowest performing students, that made up about 21% of the reason that schools weren't performing. But when you began to combine together high concentrations of our most challenging students at our largest high schools, what you started to see that accounted for over 40% of the challenge of turning around schools. And so we began a deliberative process tied to accountability, tied to a range of other levers that were available to begin to identify schools that would be closed and phased out. Now, anybody that's ever tried to buy an apartment in New York City knows full well that real estate, like other crowded cities, is a valuable commodity. And we never really had the luxury of simply shutting schools down and letting them lie fallow for a while we developed other school options. And so in New York City, the only option that we really had available to us was to begin to phase high schools down one grade at a time. We would start by not accepting a 9th grade in the school that was being phased out. But as soon as you begin to do that, the concurrent challenge, and really what Alex will talk about as soon as traffic in the subways allows him to get here, is that you need to be able to replace those large failing institutions with high concentrations of our most challenged students with other options. And that really is what the work of our New Schools Development Office has done over time. We're really fortunate here as the mayor and the chancellor and Eric talk about over 250 new schools being developed over the last 8 years. Really what that represents is the developing of a pipeline of new options that complement the replacements that we need for the schools that we're beginning to phase out. And the chancellor and others have talked about how many of the decisions we've made have been controversial. Closing a school down is not an easy thing for a community. In fact, while we were having lunch upstairs, I found out that one of the wait staff is actually a graduate of DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, which is where my dad graduated high school from. And DeWitt Clinton High School is not one of the schools that we've tried to close down over the way. It certainly had its share of challenges along the way. But anytime you went to tell me or my dad that you were going to try and close their high school, and my dad hasn't been back to that high school in over 30 or 40 years. But there's something emotional about the process of saying that these institutions that serve our communities are no longer serving them well. And so there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of anger sometimes, it's tied up in that process. Complementing that, though, has been the New Schools Development process. At the same time that we're taking something out of a community, how do we begin to bring into that community new options that show people that closing these schools down is not walking away from their communities, but in fact making a greater investment in the options that they have available. And I think one of the quiet parts of the reforms in New York City that anybody that's been on the ground has been the energy that's been put into the New Schools Development process. We were fortunate to have a range of funding, upwards of $100 million, that supported that effort from the Gates Foundation and other private organizations along the way. But the most important ingredients that went into that New Schools process was telling a range of community-based organizations, cultural partners around New York City, and most importantly, educators in our schools who could see for a long time that in fact the institutions that they were a part of were not working for students as well as they needed to. For a long time, I taught in one of those failing high schools. I certainly thought I worked really hard at Martin Luther King High School. For a time, I was the assistant principal there. But we knew day in and day out that the students that I thought were being served well in my social studies classrooms, if they got the luck of having another teacher just down the hall that wasn't as committed or didn't have the same support or energy or motivation, that in fact that student, just by luck of the draw, was not going to have the same opportunities. And so until we started closing schools down, we didn't really get people excited about the possibility that we could create something different in their place. And the New Schools Development process was a very deliberate process of bringing together school leaders that had a vision for the kind of school that they wanted to create, working to support them through the Leadership Academy and other developmental efforts. At the same time, bringing them together with community partners that could bring intellectual expertise, capacity, in many cases resources of all types, to the collaborative process of developing new schools. And so we have campuses in the Bronx, places like Erasmus is out in Brooklyn. I'm thinking of Evander Childs. These were schools that were graduating less than 30% of their students in 4 years. And that's not a school that any of us would be happy sending our students to. But as you begin to phase out a place like Evander and replace it with schools like computers and technology, with a principal by the name of Bruce Abramowitz, who's made real investments of personal time and energy to bring people together, on those same campuses in much smaller, autonomous units where that principal is responsible, along with those teachers, for 400 students. They would grow them with a 9th grade class of 100 to 108 students. The next year, as the school that they were replacing phased down, they would bring on another class of students, and over 4 years, that school would grow to full capacity. most importantly, they were growing a new culture inside of that building. Those schools that replaced at Evander, for example, went from a 30% graduation rate to upwards of 80% over a 4-year transition, with many of the same students coming from the same community and the same families, but really reinvesting in that building, not necessarily the school organization that was there before, but using that space to reinvent what a high-quality, high-caliber education could look like. We've done that in New York City, not just in the district public schools, but by inviting through charters and other pieces. And charters in New York City really represent, more than anything else, a contract with the state that says, how do we begin to free up an educational institution from the bureaucracy and many of the mandates that come with state recognition? But in exchange for that, they have a 5-year contract, a charter, that tells them that they have to meet certain obligations or else they're threatened with closure. But very clearly, this portfolio that we've created in New York City of some 1,680 schools now represents a mix of some long-standing schools, places like Brooklyn Tech, Stuyvesant High School, and others that have served their communities well for generations. It represents other schools that are still trying to find their way. Some have seen the consequences of low performance and have really begun to improve and move forward, and others have been replaced with schools that can begin to create new opportunities. And so there are hundreds of stories of new schools that have been developed. There are stories of other schools that have been motivated to move forward. And it's not a question of large or small, new or old. It's really a question of, have we created a culture of excellence inside of those school organizations? And frankly, we have a challenge now in New York City, and eventually Alex will get here and talk about it. The challenge that we have is that we can't close every school, nor do we want to close every school. The challenge is, how do we close only those schools that are our lowest performers with the greatest challenges and replace them with options that will move forward? But how do we also continue to support schools that may be in the middle of the pack? And how do we make sure we help them make their environments more accountable, more rigorous, more personalized as they're moving through? But clearly, I was here in New York City back in the 1990s. I left to go out and do national work with a national foundation, and I was attracted back to New York City in 2008 because we'd had some experience in starting new schools and really saw a different energy that was playing out in New York City that really did empower educators to play a leadership role in trying to turn around what were unsuccessful organizations in many places. And I think the work that's still ahead of us in New York City is, how do we continue to go into those schools that may still be struggling, but how do we make sure that every school in New York City is a great school? The same woman upstairs, her name was Anna, who I talked about a second ago, has a middle schooler in one of our Bronx schools, and she's really happy about that option. You may have heard Joel Klein call out Sana Nasser, who's the principal of Truman High School. They connected, talking about how her son is beginning to think about what his options are and his choices are for high school. But she's also got a daughter in 2nd grade and isn't as happy with what that experience has been right now. And that notion that until she has the same choices that many of us have had to move to other places and do other things, the working of making sure that our neighborhood schools, and really those schools that all of our families will send their kids to, that those have to be great options. That's the work of Portfolio. That's the work of New Schools Development. In a lot of ways, the turnaround effort is helping us make sure we stay focused on making sure that all of our schools are great schools.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. And just to note 2 things. First, now that we know that you're a product of New York City Public Schools, what an amazing job at contemporaneous speaking. With 4 minutes notice he just did to give you a broad sense of what the effort is like here in New York City. And something you said actually struck me. You said, anytime you close down a school is emotionally painful, but arguably it's morally necessary. So I want to come back to that in a Q&A, because it is, we'd like to learn how did you move through those challenges of dealing with invested community members and parents and teachers, et cetera, knowing the pain involved, but also the opportunity and promise of new schools. At this point, I'm going to ask Secretary Schneider to come up and offer some, yes, please, offer some comparisons with the school system in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
I would like to thank for this kind invitation. And I was intended to speak in Portuguese, but I will try to do my best in English. So maybe I will change during the presentation. I was nominated Secretary of Education of São Paulo in 2006. And two things happened in my first day. The first one is the teachers' union was involved in a strike that was the second biggest strike in the history of the city. And I'm not a former teacher, so I was a strange for them as a secretary also. So when I came to the building, they were in front of the building. I came out of the car and I started to talk to them. And after that, I have a meeting with a former secretary, an old man who was a teacher at the São Paulo University. And he said to me, the problem of bad quality in education in Brazil, that it's a perfect crime. No one is guilty about the bad quality of our education. So these two things makes me think to work in a reform with the teachers. Because when the teacher is inside the class, he's alone with the students. We can make our best in our office, but sometimes they are alone and they have to manage this situation. So all the things that I will talk to you and I will present to you today was made with our teachers in São Paulo. So this is some numbers. We have 1 million students. São Paulo has 10.2 million inhabitants, and we have 1.5 thousand schools that are administered directly by us, and we have some schools that we finance, mostly nursery schools. We put the money and they work with the children. We are responsible for early childhood, and we are responsible also for elementary and middle education. But the state level in São Paulo, it's different than Rio de Janeiro, has around 50% of the responsible for elementary and middle education in the city of São Paulo. We have just 8 high schools. It's not our role to manage the high school. So we had some goals since 5 years ago. The one is to improve the number of the students in nursery schools, children from 0 to 3 years. It's a social problem in our city, and we had to manage to improve the number of childs attended by our system. The second, to increase the school hours, decrease class size, and increase capacity. When we came, 85% of our schools were working in 3 periods of 4 hours. So it was difficult for the team at the schools to manage this situation, because we had big schools with 1,000, 2,000 children studying, and it was difficult to children to learn and to teachers to teach. Our class sizes were about 40 or 35 students each. And we had also, it's our major goal to increase the results of the students and to believe that every child can learn, and to increase the transparency. So to the parents, to the society, about what we're doing to improve also accountability of the system. we had some actions. The creation of a municipal curriculum from nursery to middle schools. How and what the teacher had to do. In Brazil, this is difficult to do because there is the teachers and the schools think that they have autonomy to do everything in the school. So we put this in March, and today we have a curriculum, and they know what they have to do and what is expected to be learned by the children. The creation of standardized tests. We didn't have until 2007 a test to know how the children were learning. And a fund of about $30 million is distributed among schools. This fund, the decision is of the school and the parents on how to put this money in pedagogical things or some things that they want to do are decided locally. The wages of the teachers were adjusted and increased by more than 50% above the inflation. A teacher assistant was hired to work in the first year of the elementary schools because we had a problem in the first grade, the first years with the literacy. So we put another teacher and a material to be used in the class for the students and for the teachers also. The transparency, all the information about what we do is in internet. And a special program with the Health Secretariat. We have physicians who visit the schools and make exams in our children, and the public system is in charge to work with it. We have here some results. The number of children attending nursery schools more than double, from 60,000 to 132,000 in this year. The number of school hours in preschools increased from 4 to 6. In elementary and middle schools, from 4 to 5, and some schools have 7 hours today. And it benefited 420,000 students. The elementary and middle level schooling years increased from 8 to 9 years. And we are still working to reduce the number of students per class. Now they are 30, but we will progressively reduce this number. And two results that are most important for us. The schools increased results year by year, and the gap between the schools with better and lower results become thinner. So there was a big gap when we started to the measure, and now it's thinner, and all the schools are going up. And the literacy rate was increased by 50% in 3 years. Through the introduction of the curriculum, the test books, another teacher in the first grade, in the first year of elementary schools, and all these things that we do. So we have a big challenge to improve our systems, but we think that working together with the teachers, we don't have to agree every time, but we have to work with them and to improve our system. We think that is the most important lesson we had in São Paulo. Thank you. And sorry about my English.
And last but not least, we have Alex Schub with us. as well as Justin Barra, who is the Chief of Staff to Deputy Commissioner Sternberg, who could not join us, and he'll be with us for questions. But I'm going to turn it over to Alex for his presentation.
Hi, folks. I apologize for our tardiness. I see some familiar faces. Thank you to Greg Bethel for kicking it off for us. If I repeat anything that he said, I apologize. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, just give an overview of the strategy we use in the Division of Portfolio Planning. I think the strategies we use to turn around schools, improve performance of our schools in general in New York City, touches on aspects of all of the parts of the Department of Education. Our strategy begins with identification of what works and what doesn't. So that starts with the Office of Accountability, and that's a separate division, and they invest tremendous time and effort into identifying which of our schools are performing at the highest level and which of our schools are in need of significant change, improvement, turning around. Second, we have our Office of Enrollment and our system of student choice, which allows students to pick the schools that they will attend, particularly at the high school level. This is essential to our strategy of turnaround as it enables us to break the cycle of schools that are not performing successfully, create a pipeline of successful schools to replace those failing schools, and then give students the option to attend the school that they think will best fit them and their family's needs. So that third part that I just referenced is the development of successful schools, a portfolio of strategies that we can put into all of these locations where we really need to improve. I think I touched on all of these aspects. We also have the charter school office and, of course, early childhood, so we can take our kids from a early childhood beginning all the way through to college readiness. This really works in a cycle, and I just touched on it, but if you look at the diagram, I think you can see how these components interact to form a coherent system. So if you start in the upper left, you see planning. That's our division that develops and implements the plans for structural change. So that's the group that identifies where we need new schools. They look at enrollment data, they look at the performance of the schools, and they diagnose the problem. Portfolio management and school development, which is the area that I run, so it's our job to find our best partner organizations that are going to bring school models that we think are worth replicating to our attention and help manage those schools for us, as well as looking for our best educators within the system so that we can put them in place. If you look at the box right below that, I think it's a key aspect of describing our strategy, which is we invest space in the best school managers. So we really consider, we have a system where we're responsible for all of the space that we own, and we are going to invest in our best ideas by giving people control of that space to run their schools. And then that rolls over to the enrollment office, who is responsible for helping the kids match to the schools that they would be most interested in. So it's quite a complex process where each of these pieces must be in place and integrated as a whole in order for the system to work. We've been using this strategy successfully since 2002 to phase out our lowest performing schools and replace them with a small school strategy. Many of the schools that we have phased out were large, underperforming schools. And to speak a bit about that, I mean, it sounds like my colleague was just speaking about that, but we felt the large schools did not give the students the attention they needed to be successful, that they had become unwieldy, that there was nobody really steering the craft in any particular direction. And in fact, it was very much the example of an inaction of a bureaucratic structure rather than an educational plan that would serve the needs of the kids in the school. And a central piece of our strategy by creating small schools was that it would allow the school leaders to have direct connection to the students and understand exactly what they needed and be able to provide them with that. I'm sure you're familiar with Chancellor Klein's initiative of principal accountability and principal autonomy. Central to this initiative and tied to the small schools movement is giving the principal as much control as possible over that school and then holding them accountable with data, rather than tightly controlling the principal with a series of mandates that must be implemented. The Chancellors Initiative has been centered around saying, look, you all try what you think is best. We've seen your performance. We're going to find the best people, put them in place. Do what you think is going to work. And then we're going to assess what works. And if it isn't working, you're subject to potentially being closed yourself. And if it is working, keep it up. So if you look at these simple statistics, we've closed 91 schools since 2002. Not all of the schools that we opened have directly replaced the schools that we closed. Some have gone to underutilized space or to new construction, but the vast majority of what you see here is part of the replacement strategy. I just want to reference a study because it's a pretty important validation of the work. So MDRC Study was just released in June, I believe, and it was a multi-year study looking at, and it was very carefully done in that it looked at students, compared students attending the new small schools to students that applied and were not accepted to those small schools through the student enrollment process in New York City. So it really controlled for a bias that I think people have properly identified before of people with families that are looking for these kind of schools. And even so, even with those same families and those same students, students in these schools significantly outperformed their peers that did not have this opportunity. They graduated at a higher rate, and they graduated at an even greater rate in 4 years. And when you consider the number of schools that we're dealing with here, it's a significant number of students. More significantly to me, and I'll tell you just a little bit about my background. If you see the Seward Park column there, I had the good fortune to open a school there. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience doing that in a minute. But to me, this is the truly significant piece of the work. So the shorter bars, the blue bars, the darker blue bars, represent the graduation rates at many of the larger schools that we phased out. And you can see they're typically in the 30s and 20s. Very low. And if you think about the thousands of kids that were attending those schools, it really was a criminal situation where these kids were going nowhere. And I'm not here to speak specifically about what happens to kids when they drop out of high school, but I think we all have a pretty good idea. And then if you look at the aqua bars, or the taller bars, those are the amalgamated graduation rates of the schools within the campuses. So you could see, I mean, they've more than doubled the performance of the schools that they replaced, I think almost to a 1, and that's an incredible difference. So Mark Sternberg, our Deputy Chancellor for Portfolio, was a principal that opened Bronx Lab School on the Evander Childs campus. And I started Essex Street Academy in the Seward Park campus. You can see it's one of the schools referenced here. I want to speak about that experience a little bit because I think it is important to highlight that this strategy is dependent on an enormous amount of work on the part of the principals and on a Herculean effort. And I'm not here to pat myself on the back, but I do want to indicate that the strategy itself does not guarantee success. The hurdles in turning around what is known as a failing campus are extremely high, from poor reputation of the building, students and families who are not particularly interested in bringing their kids there, reputations of violence, actual violence. I mean, I'll tell you, when I started in our first year on the Seward Park campus, it was worse than the most exaggerated movie you ever saw about high school. There were kids smoking weed in the school. There were people fighting in the classrooms, the teachers standing there looking. I mean, it was a scary place. And now if you went there, I mean, I would be proud to bring you there and take you on a tour. We could cut you loose. The students would take you on a tour. It's a beautiful place. But that first year, you need people who are ready to take on that challenge. I mean, I ran into the middle of fights on the street, kids swinging bottles. It had nothing to do with the contract. It had nothing to do with what I was expected to do, right? The safety agents would say, oh, there's a fight outside. You better go deal with it, right? And that was me and my staff or nobody. And if you don't have people who are willing to go that extra mile, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. So I'm not saying that to turn you off to this strategy because I firmly believe in it, but I mentioned that one piece to say you need to have a plan in place to find folks who are willing to do that. You need to have a plan in place to motivate those folks to take on those extra challenges. A big part of it was Chancellor Klein's strategy of principal empowerment. And I'll tell you, being told that I was truly responsible for the school and that I could decide how the school would function helped me to take responsibility for everything that would happen there. So that is one thing I can urge you to do. Secondly, building a campus is a challenge in and of itself. And we have a director of campus management who helps campus teams work together in the Department of Education, and that's something that we have worked on with groups of principals for a long time. But nonetheless, when you take central direct control of what should be happening in the building away, and you have a group of people who are peers who have to figure out what should be happening within that building, it can be contentious and difficult. Arguments over space, argument over resources, arguments over passing time, stairwell use, all those things can cause significant problems. And if they're not managed well, it can bring a campus down. I will say I think the Department of Education has been very responsive to those issues and has helped prevent those problems from keeping our campuses from being successful. But if this is an initiative you undertake to break up your larger schools, you need to be mindful of that. So, building our pipeline of quality applicants. We are using two very specific strategies now moving forward to make sure we have the principals we need. The first is, it's really based on my experience. I think our principals, our successful principals, are people with instructional knowledge. I think our successful principals are people who have experienced working in good schools. It is a rare person, not to say it cannot happen, but it is a rare person who can step into a school and implement a vision that they have never experienced, that they've never seen. We are looking for our next crop of best leaders in our best schools. So using our accountability measures that I referenced in the beginning, we're identifying our top, say, 100 schools. And in those 100 schools, we are asking principals to let us know who on your staff will make a quality principal. Again, along the lines of the principal empowerment, I believe principals have the best window onto who makes a good principal. They know, they're doing the job, and they can tell us. By incentivizing the relationship between the principal and the person they nominate, by offering financial support and incentives to the mentor school, should the person they nominate be successful, we help ensure that, one, the principal is willing to give up their best talent, which is a real impediment to people saying, hey, I want my AP who's actually making my life livable to move on. And second, we think they'll nominate people they think are going to be successful. So we've just started this program as a pilot, but I will say that 8 of our strongest applicants in this current round that we're going through are coming through this mentor plan, and I think it's going to be a real success moving forward. Second, we're engaging external organizations that have a track record of success. We are looking at their performance, and we are establishing accountability measures. And I think that's crucial. In the last round of partner-developed schools, the funding for those partner organizations came from the Gates organization, went directly to the partners. The partners came to us and said, here's what we want to do. We mostly said, thanks, great, let's give it a shot. And I think it worked in the sense of working within that model of, let 1,000 flowers bloom and then see which ones we're going to cut. But now that the funding is coming from the state through the Department of Education, we have the opportunity to say to partner organizations, this is what we need you to provide for us to fund you to open one of our schools. And we want to see, one, a fully thought out plan for instruction and instructional implementation in the school. It is not enough to say we're going to raise standards. It is not enough to say we're going to make sure the school is well organized. You need to have a strategy. You can tell teachers, this is what we want to see you doing in the classroom. This is what effective instruction looks like. Too often people say we're going to add rigor, we're a college-bound program, and you say, well, what is it you're going to tell teachers to do? And they say, be rigorous. It doesn't really tell a new teacher what to do. So we find our most effective organizations have it thought out to, there should be a 5-minute teacher presentation, then there should be a workshop model. This is what the workshop model should look like. Assessment should be skill-oriented, et cetera, et cetera. And different groups have different ideas, but you could really tell a group that knows what they're talking about in terms of instruction, and I think you'll see that the results they produce will line up accordingly. We're also looking for ongoing embedded support for the teachers being provided by the partner organization. It is not enough to have the plan on paper, to take the staff on a weekend-long retreat, and then good luck, which is, I think, something a lot of our schools experienced in the last round. We want someone from that partner organization in the school, in the classrooms, helping the principal to help the teachers bring this vision to life. So, how are we using this strategy to turn around schools? We're bringing in these partner organizations. We're finding our best leaders from within New York City schools, and we're implementing a few of the models that you see below. So there's turnaround, phase in, and phase out. That's where we close the larger school, typically a larger school, and slowly grow the new school within. So in case you're unfamiliar with it, it means the school that is phasing out stops accepting ninth graders. The new school that opens starts with only a ninth grade class. That's how I started my school, and I'll tell you a huge strength there is when we started our school, I started with 108 ninth graders. And as difficult as it was moving into the new building and all of the challenges that I was describing, I felt like I could personally take on 108 children and win, which is pretty much what it was like. And that the culture, I very much felt like the culture of the school was built by me and my 5 founding teachers together. But whenever it was really difficult, they'd all say, Alex, now what do we do? And really the principal is building that culture. And if you're starting with a whole school, it can be quite difficult. That said, we are interested to try turnaround kids in schools stay the same. So this is a strategy that has been described by the federal government and by the state as something they're hopeful that we can try. We're going to give it a shot. It's where the kids in the school all stay. So the new incoming principal and incoming staff, and I'll talk about that in a second, would take on the school as a whole with an incoming ninth grade class. So that does have the added challenge of needing to change the culture for the kids that have been there. That is a daunting task. There are few people with the optimism and enthusiasm willing to try this. We are going to try it in New York City, and we found a few partner organizations that have some strategies that we think could be successful. I will say it is a holistic approach that is necessary. You must engage the community and prepare them for the change, not just internally, but externally. You must have that instructional plan figured out. You must have a plan for managing behavior in the building aggressively. And my personal bent is that does not mean authoritarian control. It means changing often from a failed authoritarian control structure to one where kids are cared for and kids are treated as human beings. Too often, once a school has been failing for a long time, kids have been criminalized in those situations. Again, that's not really what I'm here to speak about, but I think you know what I'm referencing, and that's a difficult culture to change. Transformation is our lightest touch. So, I left something out. For turnaround kids in school staying the same, we must turn over at least 50% of the staff. And that is part of that initiative as it is written into the grant, and it is a crucial part of the reform enabling the principal to get somewhat of a fresh start with their faculty. In transformation, the lightest touch, if the principal has been there for more than 3 years, we're obligated to change the principal. There is a significant amount of funding made available to bring in master teachers and turnaround teachers as identified by our Human Resources Department. Another example of how all these initiatives pull on all the parts of our organization. And then there's funding to bring in external organizations to provide extensive support, extended day, summer sessions, vacation sessions, things of the like. And then Restart is the turnaround phase in, phase out, but using charter organizations to replace rather than a district model. I skipped over one thing that I just want to touch on, the school improvement grants. So there's a significant amount of money that the state has offered up to make these initiatives a success, to the tune of $2 million a building for each one of these initiatives when they're happening. So we're very optimistic that with this funding we should be able to make even more dramatic improvements than we did in the last round, as you saw in the graphs, and hopefully get to where we're providing all of our kids a real quality education. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And it was not lost on me that in that graph he showed, the school that he started had the very highest graduation rate. So we can pat you on the back.
You can do it again.
to say congratulations. Okay, we have 20 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So please, if you have a question, come to the microphone in the center and identify yourself and ask any of our panelists questions based on the presentations, or if you'd like to share some things from your local communities, that would be useful as well.
Hi, my name is Susan Crawford, and I have two children. One is 20 now, the other's 15, still in the system. And I run something called the Right to Read Project, and it addresses literacy issues. And so I have some questions based directly on what your presentation is, but also I have an ongoing series of questions to each panel about what is being done to address the literacy problems that I'm sure you're encountering at the high school level. And for instance, the graduation rates, when I see 67%, 72%, et cetera, there is about a 1/3 rate of illiteracy throughout the country anyway, no matter what, and about 20% is dyslexic. So what specifically, when I see those graduation rates, are the children taking longer to graduate, or are these the children who are dropping out? What particular, say, did you do in your school? And one other question about the whole closure.
That's three questions.
Oh, sorry. I'm asking for three people. Parents are upset about the big, busy high schools disappearing because kids want options. They don't want to make a career decision in 8th grade.
Okay.
So.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so literacy strategies. Let me start by talking about what we did in our school, and I think for us it was an evolving, we had an evolving strategy. So we developed, our school is what I would call a skill-focused, we had a skill-focused educational plan, and I think the Common Core standards are kind of coming along and now catching up to what we invented. So the skill-focused plan, we started by looking at standards that we think kids needed to achieve at the college level in each of the disciplines and plan backwards so that we would design assessments in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade that would guide teachers to make sure kids were developing the skills they needed in analyzing literature and developing historical arguments and doing work as a professional scientist would, using the scientific method to answer their own questions, and using mathematical reasoning to come up with novel answers to problems they encountered. And we believe that if kids develop mastery over those skills to answer new questions or problems that they encountered, they'd be able to handle whatever content they encountered at the college level, that it's more of a depth versus breadth approach. So we started that, and we actually had tremendous success in engaging our kids in education. A lot of, certainly when we started the school and nobody knew what our school was, people were not very interested in coming. And we got a lot of kids over the counter, as it's described, who are kids that weren't placed in any school. I only say that to say we had a very difficult population of kids who were very far behind their grade level. So our approach was very successful in exciting them about learning, in demonstrating to them that learning can be interesting, in connecting them to the idea of going to college. But I will say that while we had over a 93% graduation rate for that first class, we tracked their performance in college, and about 50% of them were not able to do the work there. And that was a sobering realization for us. I would still have to say I was very proud of the accomplishments of those kids, and I'll tell you, when a kid comes to your high school 3 or 4 years behind their grade level, to me the notion that they're going to leave you in 4 years having done 8 years of learning, especially when there's someone who has none of the habits or skills needed to make that progress, is perhaps pie in the sky. However, after looking at those first results, we realized we needed to do a lot more to remediate literacy. So we did something that was somewhat anathema to our philosophy when we started, which was building in assessments for all the kids when they got to our school, leveling them. We leveled our literature programs. I'm against tracking for all of the reasons in the literature. However, my literature teachers convinced me. They said, look, we have kids going through our school that never read a book. They read chapters, they read paragraphs, they read parts. They can't read the books we're assigning because we wanted to assign engaging, difficult books. So we leveled it. We added extra periods for the kids who are performing at the lowest levels. We added teachers, a literacy specialist to the staff, which we didn't have before, to provide targeted instruction. And we're seeing some real improvement there. I'll say, our school sort of started with the high-minded and then regressed, I'd say, and not regressed as if moving backwards, but then came towards adding the remediation. Many schools, particularly that started when our school started with double period literacy blocks and double period math blocks to make sure that the bulk of the students that they're dealing with had the opportunity to catch up. And I think you may run into, a flip side difficulty there of parents saying, well, what if my child is up to speed and now they're missing out on art or they're missing out on these other things that can make the high school experience engaging. But there were so many kids who were behind that many principals decided to go that route.
Secretary Schneider?
May I answer in Portuguese?
Absolutely. So Secretary Schneider is going to answer in Portuguese, so please put your headsets on. Channel 1.
Bom, como eu disse
Well, as I said in my presentation, the first thing that we have to do is to address the issues in the first year so that we don't have problematic students who will take the problems ahead. So the investments in the first years, besides the Greek curriculum that we didn't have, and also learning, external learning that we didn't have, was to build a structural material for the teacher and for the student so that they could daily have their activities. So we reduced the autonomy of the teachers that they had before. On the other hand, other measures, such as to bring to the regular classes at least 1 hour of reading. In other words, children will have to read, and we'll have a teacher that at that time will work with reading with children. And since we have in São Paulo, such as in other large cities in Brazil, still a situation of low income, generalized low income, many of these students can't read, not only because formal education wasn't good, but because their parents never read and the parents never have access to books. So we formed a specific program for our students in which we have built up libraries for our students, and they have to read books, and that one that they will have to address in the classroom, and the other that they will have to read with their friends and families, which didn't happen before. And they're forming also reading books within the students of the outskirts of the city of São Paulo for older students who advanced without developing a lot of needed skills. What we do is we work outside of the regular classroom hours with teachers who will work with many students of different levels to address their needs, reading needs, which has been helping us overcome the challenges. But I think what's most important and crucial is to work since early childhood so that the students can develop their skills throughout the years, the school years.
Would you come up to the microphone, please? And we're very short on time, so I'm going to have to ask you to be very concise with your questions, and to the panelists as well with your answers. Thanks.
The question is for Alex. I'm Mercedes Miguel from Argentina, Buenos Aires. I am the Educational Planning Strategy Director. And I was wondering to know, how did you manage teacher unions to tell them that you were going to close schools? Mm-hmm. Because in my country, that is unacceptable. Mm-hmm. I mean, we in city of Buenos Aires, we have 17 teacher unions, 17. And they sit down with us and we have to work with them. But I was wondering to know if you tell them before, or you just did it?
Great, thank you. It's all yours.
Well, that's a great question. It's an ongoing issue, I'd say. It's a negotiation that we're constantly involved in. I mean, I think it's something that it's a delicate problem. I mean, we need to be respectful and mindful of the teachers working in the schools. At the same time, we have to hold the schools to the high standards that we want to establish for all of our kids. So while the union is there to just stand up for their teachers, and the Chancellor and the Department of Ed is there to try and push the high standards for all of the kids, there's bound to be some conflict. So, you know, they sit down at the table and they try to work out agreements. I think last year we hit some bumps in the road, and this year we're trying to be more proactive, I would say, and engage folks in a more meaningful conversation to make sure that we, you know, can find the right compromises. But I don't think there's an easy answer.
And I should say that teachers' unions are strong here in the U.S. and in New York. I think they're strongest in the world in Argentina. So you have, really deeper challenges and stronger challenges in that regard. Greg wanted to answer this question as well.
To be a bit more practical, I think it's really important to distinguish between the teachers and the teachers' union. And there are 80,000 teachers in New York City, many of them not happy about the conditions that they're working in. And I think one of the important things that I think we could have done better, and I think Alex and the team in Portfolio are working on now, this was never a conversation about the teachers and their failures. This was a conversation about the conditions that existed on these campuses, that despite how hard people were working, the trajectory for success was nearly impossible because of those concentrations we were talking about earlier. So I think one of the key things, and we started to see it, as we started to get momentum around the effort, the issue was how through this process of phase out and starting new schools did we create better conditions for teachers to work in that they would begin to value. And then, I mean, the reality is over 300 schools now in the city are being taught by unionized teachers, working under the same contract, but with a core belief that the new settings they've created are where they want to be. And so I think early communication is important, but it can't start out as a battle between management and the unions. It's got to start out based on the data with an acknowledgement that the work we've been doing together is not serving the interests of students and their families well. And the question is, how do we move forward from there? And I think we had some early missteps. To Joel's point earlier, the boldness of the effort was making sure that we stayed focused on having to do something different. But I think the process that we have this year is doing a better job of engaging a broader range of community stakeholders, working more closely with the unions. And one of the important things that happened early on, and it was in the contract, for schools that we phased out, the new schools coming in were required to interview at least 50% of the teachers to see whether or not they were good fits for that new school coming in. So it wasn't simply about moving those teachers out of the way. And I think if we treat teachers like professionals and work with them in this process, we go a long way. But at the same time, we can't compromise, to your point earlier, Dorian, about the moral imperative with this. It isn't about the teachers. It's not about us as administrators. It's about the set of outcomes that matter for kids. 30% to 80% is proof that this work can work. Can we do it better in engaging people as we move forward with that? Certainly.
Great, please.
I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. Mike Walter, I'm Assistant Deputy Minister from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And I just want to be clear on your definition of closure, just so I'm on the same wavelength. Are you saying that the school's empty, the building is shut down, and all kids are transferred to another facility?
No, that's not. So that is one of the 4 strategies that's been identified by the state and the federal government. But no, what I was referring to is what we call phase in and phase out, where you bring in a new school and the school that was there already stops taking in new students.
So eventually it does become an empty facility, though?
No, because the new school that you put in there will grow into the space. So often, if it was a really large school, we might put several schools in that will grow and fill the space, as we did in the campus I worked.
I'm going to jump in and see if I can clarify this for our international friends here, because I think this is part of the answer to the issue of the union issue. From a legal point of view, New York City closes schools precisely, it's not the only reason, but precisely because that gives them a new opportunity to start over again. So the building may be the same, and in fact the students in the school may be largely the same. It depends upon the model that's put into place, as Alex was pointing out earlier. But the issue as it relates to the law in New York, and that's the critical variable here that distinguishes what's going on in New York from some of the international examples of 17 unions sitting down, is this turns out to be a very interesting strategy that has allowed New York to turn over some really lousy schools, bad performing schools, and deal with the legal constraints that some of the teachers' union earlier contracts had imposed upon the school system. Not talking about teachers, but talking about negotiated contracts. So, you know, let's be clear about that since we're sharing best practices among friends. This was a strategy based upon the law that gives us an opportunity to start over again in some of the neighborhood schools that were the lowest performing schools and get really good schools in neighborhoods that have been starved of these schools for 50 years. And they're not all charters. Most of them are actually neighborhood-based public schools. But we had to close the school, literally, in order to give us an opportunity to start over again. I think that if that law wasn't on the books, we would have a different kind of strategy in place to deal with turnover and change, and frankly to get rid of low-performing principals and low-performing teachers in this context as well. So it's something for everybody to think about. It's the legal constraints that you have in your system and how to get around them, frankly, if that's what you have to do. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Fuchs. Last question.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Mamta from India, New Delhi. My question is that what are the measurable parameters you decided when you said low-performing schools? Was it only the dropout rate and you said the number of graduate students or anything else? What were the measurable parameters? My first question.
So our accountability system in New York takes a number of things into account. I mean, it's a relatively complex thing, but I'll try and summarize it to the best of my ability. So I think one really important measure is that 3/4 of a school's accountability are based on comparing it to schools within its peer group. And those peer groups are established based on performance of the students coming in on earlier exams. So 1/4 of the school's performance is based on its comparative performance to the city, and 3/4 to schools that have a similar population to it. And then there's a variety of categories that are looked at to make up the school's grade, its attendance, a survey that's filled out by students, teachers, and parents about how they feel the school is doing in terms of communicating with them, academic rigor, and a variety of other categories. Then there's graduation rates and different measures of graduation. There's bonus points available for the performance of students in the lowest third. And then there's the progress that students are making in terms of how many credits they're earning year to year, and again, bonus points for the performance of students in the lowest third. So those are the major categories that make up what we call the school progress report, and that is the first piece of information we use to determine if schools should be on our list to investigate for closure. After that, we have anecdotal reports from the network leaders and cluster leaders, who are people that work closely with the schools. And then finally, we look at the demand for the school based on enrollment trends and schools in the area, and whether we have the capacity to close a school, meaning will we be able to cite those students elsewhere, do we need another school there, et cetera.
Secretary Schneider, did you want to respond to this?
No, just one comment. In Brazil, like in Argentina, it's against the law some strategies that you made here, especially the sticks, fire teachers or fade-out schools. So I would like to ask you about the carrots that you use as strategies also, because we are discussing just the sticks here, but maybe there are carrots also.
There are some carrots, but they're like those baby carrots, So, I mean, there's incentive pay or performance pay that is given to principals if their schools perform in the highest levels, and if the schools do well year after year. To me, the biggest incentive, though, is simply the autonomy that principals have to decide on the instructional program in their school, as long as their school continues to perform well. Getting free of that tight district control was an enormous liberation for me as an educator, and it's what made me interested in being a principal after being a teacher and an assistant principal, where I felt like we were ducking all the time, you know? So those are the main ones that came home for me.
Great. We are out of time, and we want to make sure you're alert for the very next session. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists, Greg Bethel, Justin Barra, Alex Schub, and Secretary Schneider.